Our story continues in the Eterna Gym, with Ash and Paul about to face Gardenia. Due to Gardenia requesting it, Paul is going to be the first to challenge, much to Ash's dismay, and so he enters the forested ring, while Ash heads for the stands. When Paul's in position, Gardenia explains that this will be a 3-on-3 battle, with the same rules as the Oreburg Gym. She then brings out her Turtwig and requests that Paul does the same. Ash asks if gym leaders are allowed to choose their opponent's Pokemon, but Paul says of course not. He then takes a moment to think, with Ash knowing that Paul's drive to prove his superiority in direct competition is currently at war with his strategy of dominating opponents through type matchups. Ultimately it seems that pride wins out, and Paul chooses Turtwig as his first Pokemon. Decisively, Paul calls for a bite, but Gardenia's Turtwig is faster, coming in for a tackle at blistering speed that catches both Paul and his Pokemon off guard. Turtwig is sent rolling backwards, and Gardenia praises her Turtwig, saying it's number 1. Paul is less effusive, just telling Turtwig to get up. Turtwig does so, and Paul orders it to use Toxic, calling the little grass type to spew a torrent of noxious purple liquid, which bathes its opponent, poisoning it. Gardenia tells her Turtwig to stay strong, and admits that poisoning it was a clever trick, but adds that all Paul's achieved is set a time limit on how quickly they have to beat him and Turtwig. Paul says talk is cheap, and goads her to call another attack. Gardenia falls for this, and calls for another tackle, but this just plays into Paul's hands. Deftly, he calls for an Absorb, and his Turtwig fires a beam of red light, which catches Gardenia's. Caught in the Absorb, Gardenia's Turtwig halts in its tracks and writhes in pain, as the damage from its earlier tackle fades from Paul's Turtwig. Gardenia tells it to shake it off, but even when it manages to do this, Gardenia's Turtwig is not out of the woods, as it immediately shudders, feeling the effects of the poison in its system. Paul then calls for a bite, and with Gardenia's Turtwig still immobilized by pain, Paul's is able to get in and clamp its jaw around the sapling on Gardenia's Turtwig's head. It then uses this leverage to hurl Gardenia's Turtwig skywards, causing the gym leader's Pokemon to panic. Gardenia remains calm and orders a Leaf Storm, but Paul just has his Turtwig stay where it is and use Absorb, largely negating the effectiveness of this attack. When Gardenia's Turtwig lands, it grimaces as another Poison Flare leaves it weak. Paul then says it's time to wrap things up with a final Absorb, which Gardenia's Turtwig cannot resist, howling and writhing until it finally falls silent and unconscious. Gardenia thanks her friend for a great battle before calling out her Cherubi. Paul doesn't hesitate, recalling his Turtwig as well and replacing it with Scyther. Gardenia admits that a bug-flying type is about as good a choice as one can make in a grass gym. She does, however, say this just makes her and Cherubi want to beat it even more. Gardenia then calls for a Magical Leaf, while Paul has his Scyther use Agility. At once, Scyther's movements become a blur and it is able to avoid the leaves. However, this makes Gardenia smile, and she warns Paul that even the speediest dodge can't avoid Magical Leaf. On cue, the glowing leaves then do a 180 and shoot back towards Scyther. Paul just demands that Scyther take it, and then use another Agility. Scyther obeys, enduring the hit before resuming its speedy dashing around the ring. Gardenia seems a little disappointed by this choice, saying she much preferred Turtwig's offensive style to whatever this is, but sighs that if Paul won't attack, then that job will fall to her. She then calls for a Solar Beam, and Cherubi begins to charge up, gathering sunlight around itself. This seems to have no effect on Paul, who calls for a third Agility, which Scyther does, its movements getting almost impossible to make out with the naked eye. Finally, Cherubi finishes charging, and Gardenia tells it to unleash its Solar Beam. The cherry Pokemon chirps its agreement, then lets loose a huge beam of golden energy, which soars right at the stationary Scyther. For a moment, Ash wonders if Paul's run out of ideas, but then sees that he's smirking and realizes everything has transpired exactly according to Paul's plan. At the very last moment, Paul calls for a final Agility, and Scyther seems to teleport out of harm's way with how quick its movements have become. It then appears behind Cherubi, and Paul orders Fury Cutter. One sweep from Scyther's bladed arms is enough to send Cherubi flying, but before it can land, Scyther is already in front of it again, and launches it once more with another Fury Cutter. Again, Cherubi goes flying, and again Scyther is waiting to smack it back into the air with Fury Cutter. This pattern continues with each consecutive hit, getting harder and faster, to the point where before long, it seems as if there are a dozen after-images of Scyther playing a game of volleyball, with Cherubi as the unfortunate ball. To make matters worse, the constant spinning and falling have left Cherubi disorientated and unable to hear Gardenia's pleas and orders. Finally, Paul grows tired of playing with his food, and so has Scythe use its last Fury Cutter to spike Cherubi into the ground. The impact is so great that it creates a crater, with cracks spanning almost the entire arena, and when Cherubi emerges, it is unable to battle. Gardenia tells Cherubi to rest, before sending out her final Pokemon, Roserade. Like before, Paul switches out his Pokemon despite having barely taken any damage, and chooses Chimchar to round out his team. Chimchar looks excited to battle, but Paul snaps at it to focus and use Flame Wheel. Chimchar obeys, but Gardenia doesn't seem troubled, instead waiting for Chimchar to get close, then calling for a flash. As if a flashbang had gone off, the gym suddenly illuminates for a moment, forcing the trainers to shield their eyes. However, at such close range, Chimchar is unable to do so, and is blinded, causing it to veer off course and crash into a tree. While Chimchar rubs its head and blinks to get its sight back, Paul calls it pathetic, and says to use Flame Wheel again, but not to screw it up this time. Gardenia jokes that he should not be so hard on his Pokemon, then calls for a Grass Knot, which bursts out of the ground at Chimchar's feet, tangling it up. Chimchar trips over, but manages to stick the landing by using the fall to tumble into a Flame Wheel, and charges once more at Roserade. Roserade tanks the hit, but then Gardenia has it use Weather Ball, which it forms in its hand and slams like a mace onto the top of Chimchar's head. Chimchar yelps, then falls forward, only for a second Weather Ball to hit it in the back and send it crashing into the dirt several feet away. Gardenia then has Roserade use Grass Knot again, binding Chimchar at the wrists and ankles, leaving it flat on its stomach and exposed to a finishing blow. To end things, she calls for a giant Weather Ball, and Roserade begins charging it over its head as it advances on the prone Chimchar. But Paul refuses to take this lying down, quite literally, and so tells Chimchar to use Ember on itself. Chimchar whimpers as it sears its own skin, but its loyalty to Paul wins out, and so it pushes through, burning away the grass knots holding its paws. Paul then orders it to use Dig, just in time to pull itself underground and out of the way of Weather Ball. Roserade's attack caves in the tunnel, exactly where Chimchar's head had been moments before, and as the ground shakes, Ash, Paul and Gardenia all wonder if Chimchar was too late after all. Then, Chimchar bursts from the ground. It shifts and gives Paul an idea. Instead of attacking Roserade, he tells it to use Dig again. Gardenia asks what he's thinking, since a ground-type move won't be nearly as effective as Ember or Flame Wheel, but Paul says he's not aiming for Roserade, then tells Chimchar to emerge from Cherubi's crater. With tremendous force, Chimchar resurfaces, but thanks to the structural instability of its exit point, this creates a miniature earthquake, with all the cracks in the battlefield growing. One such crack happens to be under Roserade's foot, and before it can get away, it is stuck and unable to move. This gives Paul just what he needs, and he orders a Flame Wheel which strikes the helpless Roserade head-on. There is a moment of collision, then Chimchar manages to dislodge Roserade, throwing it onto its back and out of the battle. Gardenia admits that she's never had a battle end quite like that, then hands Paul the Forest Badge. Paul takes it in silence, while Gardenia calls to Ash that she will be ready to face him in a little while, and that he and his Pokemon should relax until then. Ash says that's fine by him, and so he and Paul depart. While stopping at a cafe for lunch, Paul surprises Ash by asking if he actually intends to face Gardenia today. Ash says of course he does, and Paul tells him that it's a bad idea. It encourages him to come back after he's caught more Pokemon with a type advantage over grass and poison types. Even though this is delivered in stern tones, Ash can't help but smile, as this advice sounds more like the real Paul, rather than the jerk he's been recently. But this belief is promptly shattered when Paul coldly states that all Ash has is his reject of a Starly, and there's no way that thing can beat all three of Gardenia's Pokemon. This annoys Ash, who defensively says that he has faith in Starly, but Paul chides that faith is just another word for baseless wishing. Ash retorts that if Paul doesn't want to watch his battle, no one's forcing him to, but Paul says he's got nothing better to do. So, after paying for their meal, the brothers return to Eterna Gym, where Gardenia is waiting. She welcomes Ash, then decides to shake things up by starting off with Cherubi. Meanwhile, Ash, as expected, picks Starly as his first Pokemon. After doing a few laps, Starly lands on its new trainer's arm, and he tells it that it's gonna do great. However, it is staring past him, to Paul, and it takes Ash a few tries to get Starly's attention. When they're on the same page, Ash wishes Starly luck, and orders it to start off with an aerial ace. Eager to impress, the small flying type blasts off at top speed, slamming into Cherubi and causing it to wince. But Starly is not done yet, and Ash has it perform a tight turn, and drive its wing into the back of Cherubi's head with a wing attack. This sends Cherubi tumbling end over end, but Gardenia stays resolute and just tells her Pokemon to use Sunny Day. At once, the light filling the gym becomes harsh, and Starly briefly has to shade its eyes while it adjusts. This lull in attacks gives Gardenia the chance to call for a Solar Beam, which fires immediately. As Starly narrowly dodges, Ash demands to know why it didn't charge up like it did when she used it against Paul. Gardenia answers that Solar Beam is instantly charged in harsh sunlight. Cherubi then fires another Solar Beam, which takes Starly by surprise, and hits it head-on, knocking it out of the sky. Gardenia then adds that thanks to Cherubi's ability, Chlorophyll, it can also attack twice as fast in the sunshine. Ash grits his teeth and asks Starly if it can keep going. Starly chirps that it can, then steadily gets back into the air. Having no ranged attacks, the pair have no choice but to get in close, so Ash calls for a Steel Wing. Starly's wings take on a metallic sheen, and it dashes towards the grass type, but Cherubi is ready, firing off another speedy Solar Beam. With a desperate cry to dodge, Starly is able to avoid the worst of the attack, only taking a glancing blow on the wing. But when this happens, Ash notices something odd, that Solar Beam seems to reflect off the wing. This gives him an idea, and so tells Starly to regroup, then go for another aerial ace. Starly flies up high, before tucking its wings in and dive-bombing Cherubi. Gardenia shakes her head, saying that part of a gym leader's job is to teach novice trainers, and that despite her best efforts, it seems that she hasn't been able to impart the lesson that he can't just rush headlong at every obstacle. So, though it pains her to do it, she'll just have to hope the sting of defeat will be able to get the message across. She then calls for a point-blank Solar Beam to finish off Starly. But this is exactly what Ash wanted, and he tells his Pokemon to block the attack with Steel Wing. Starly brings its wings up in front of its face, and when they take on that metal look again, the incoming Solar Beam bounces off them and is reflected back at Cherubi. But getting its own attack launched back at it is not the end of Cherubi's problem, for as soon as it is stunned by the reflected Solar Beam, Starly lowers its wings and finishes executing that aerial ace. When Starly and Cherubi collide, there is an explosive sound, and a cloud of dust obscures them both. But when it fades, Starly is preening, while Cherubi lies unconscious. Gardenia returns it with her thanks, then brings out Turtwig, while Ash decides to stick with Starly. As Starly takes the air again, it once more looks back at Paul, clearly hoping for praise, but gets nothing more than stony silence. This seems to fire it up, and it glares fiercely at Turtwig, who meets its eyes with resolute determination. There is a pause, then Ash tells Starly to start out with a Steel Wing. Starly dashes at Turtwig, but Gardenia has it use Bite. Using its renowned speed, Turtwig leaps into the air and clamps its jaws around one of Starly's wings. This causes the flying type to lose balance and go careening into the dirt. Turtwig then darts back, and Gardenia has it use a Leaf Storm, which catches Starly and buffets it inside a vortex of razor-sharp leaves. Ash tells Starly to use a wing attack to break out of Leaf Storm, but caught up as it is, Starly can do little more than bat at the leaves. Gardenia says that if Starly wants out of the Leaf Storm, it had only to ask, telling Turtwig to use Tackle. Turtwig then lunges into the vortex, smashing into Starly and knocking it to the ground before landing on top of it. From this angle, Starly finds itself facing Paul once more, and feebly it cries for some sort of care from its former trainer. However, instead of compassion, Starly only gets one word out of Paul: pathetic. This contempt makes Starly's blood boil, and through its anger it finds a new reserve of strength, greater than it ever could have imagined. Meanwhile, from the outside, the onlookers witness a much more physical kind of metamorphosis, as Starly's body grows to double its previous size. With a resounding cry of its new name, Staravia bursts out from underneath Turtwig and takes to the sky once more. Even Paul can't help but raise an eyebrow at this, while Ash is beside himself with delight, telling Staravia that it's the best. Then in joyous tones, he tells it to use Aerial Ace. Doing a loop, Staravia dive bombs Turtwig, knocking it off its feet and sending it tumbling end over end into the air. But this is not the end. Using its new powerful legs, Staravia then kicks off the ground and hurtles upwards, hitting Turtwig with a second Aerial Ace that drives it into the ceiling. There is a sickening crunch, and Turtwig drops to the ground, unable to battle. Gardenia has nothing but praise for both Turtwig and Staravia as she brings her Pokemon back. She then asks Ash if he plans to go for a clean sweep, and when he says he does, she brings out her Roserade. Wanting to end things quickly, Ash orders a double Aerial Ace combo, but Gardenia just tells Roserade to use Weather Ball. The Grass type nods its understanding, charging green energy in one hand. Then, when Staravia is close, it thrusts the orb upwards so that it collides with Staravia in a cloud of smoke. Ash and Gardenia both hold their breath as Staravia emerges from the smoke cloud, but it soon becomes clear that it is falling rather than flying, and it plummets to the earth, lying unconscious at Roserade's feet. Ash says that Staravia did a great job and earned a good rest, and returns it to its ball. He then brings out Pickled, while Gardenia asks if Ash knows that Pickled isn't actually a flying type, despite looking like a bird. Ash says that he is aware of this, but he has a plan nonetheless. Gardenia says that far be it from her to stand in the way of a man with a plan, then tells her Roserade to use Magical Leaf. Glowing leaves with points like daggers fly at Pickled, but Ash seems unafraid, and tells his partner to use Bide. Curling up, Pickled begins to glow faintly, and when the magical leaves hit, the glow only intensifies. Gardenia smiles that she understands his plan now, and that reflecting her Pokemon's own power back at it worked once before, so she can see why he'd try it. However, she feels there is one little flaw. Ash asks what this is, and Gardenia says that Pickled still has to be conscious to use this move, something that is far from guaranteed against a grass type. Ash says that Pickled's tough, and to take her best shot, a challenge which Gardenia welcomes. She then has Roserade fire off another volley of magical leaves which hit hard, but only increase Pickled's glowing aura. Seeing that even this is not enough, she calls for another, and another after that. Both hit, and by now Pickled looks about ready to collapse, but knowing Ash has faith in it, it stays strong and continues to build up power. Finally, Pickled feels ready and fires off a beam of pure white light, large enough to take up a third of the ring. Roserade tries to run, but is caught in the blast and lost in a cloud of smoke. Ash and a thoroughly exhausted Pickled hug, but Gardenia chuckles not to count their starlies before they hatch. Ash asks what she means, but soon sees for himself when Roserade steps out of the smoke, battered but clearly still able to battle. Ash gulps, knowing that Pickled probably can't afford to take any more damage, but estimates that Roserade is probably in the same state. He therefore knows that this next attack will be the deciding blow. Gardenia seems to know the same thing, and calls for a weather ball, as Ash orders Peck. The fatigued Pokemon lunge at each other, with Pickled's beak glowing, and Roserade using the weather ball as brass knuckles. When they meet, an explosion goes off, and when the dust settles, the combatants lock eyes, then collapse in unison. With Ash still having one Pokemon left, he is declared the winner, and Gardenia hands him a forest badge with her compliments. Ash accepts the badge with pride, and so both brothers depart, having beaten the Eterna Gym. As a result, the next destination is obvious, and so Ash and Paul begin making their way southeast towards Hearthome City. However, on the fourth night of their journey, they are suddenly beset by howling winds, freezing rain, and even lightning, which makes the brothers desperately seek shelter. In the distance, they spot a Pokemon Center on the other side of an old shrine gate, and so make haste, passing through the gate, only to find that the storm has suddenly stopped. Turning to each other, Ash and Paul acknowledge how strange this is, shrugging that they'd always heard the weather nearer to Mount Coronet was weird, but this is unlike anything they've ever seen before. However, they don't get long to ponder this, as a familiar voice calls to them from the doorway of the Pokemon Center. Looking up, they see Reggie smiling and waving, and he beckons them over, saying he was just on his way to Eterna City to find them. Paul, ever the pragmatist, asks if something is wrong, but Reggie's grin only grows, and he tells them it's quite the opposite. After their spectacular battles against Gardenia, they have both been invited to take part in the Pokemon World Playoffs, with the chance to become the world champion Pokemon Master. This fills Ash with glee, and even Paul allows himself a rare, honest smile, as Reggie ushers them to come with him, since their matches are about to start and they can't afford to be late. Merrily, the three siblings begin walking together until a burning pain in Ash's head roots him to the spot. For a moment, he sees a flash of purple, followed by the sound of a young voice ringing in his head. Urgently, the voice pleads with him to remember, but who or what it wants him to remember, Ash does not know. Nor does he have long to think about it, as Reggie calls to Ash from up ahead, telling him to get a move on. The familiar sound of Reggie's voice washes away the lingering panic brought on by this strange occurrence, and so Ash runs to catch up with his brothers, excited for the battles to come. And that's where we'll leave things. How will our heroes fare in their upcoming battles? Who was that strange voice that asked Ash to remember? And is there more to the Pokemon World Playoffs than meet the eye? Find out when the journey continues.